unfortunately were preserved because of that last-minute deal.
Right.
What can you tell us about Social Security?
Right.
Was Social Security facing automatic cuts?
Well, yeah, and actually under the sequester, there were not any direct cuts aimed at Social Security. But anytime there's a major discussion in Washington about our entitlement programs, Social Security always comes up. I mean, Social Security is a very large program. Lots of people rely on it, millions of people. And so there have been, various proposals to, look at the retirement age, and we also heard that on the Medicare side. And there was a proposal that did come out at one point about changing basically the automatic inflation adjustment that's provided to Social Security each year. And as soon as that proposal came out, it got a really swift negative reaction, and the people that were throwing the idea out there kind of walked away from it. So at least in the short term, there's no imminent cuts to Social Security, but we do expect as further discussions take place that this could certainly come up again.
Again, right, could come up, and that cost of living adjustment.
Right.
And again, as you say, millions of people rely on that Social Security, so very, very important entitlement.
Indeed.
So I guess the big question a lot of people want to know is, so did Congress and the President do away with these automatic cuts and these proposed tax increases when they passed the American Taxpayer Relief Act earlier this month?
Right. Well, they did in part. Those automatic cuts that I talked about, the sequester cuts, they were put on the shelf for 2 months. All right, so one of the ones that we didn't really talk about is there was going to be a 2% across-the-board cut to all Medicare providers. So that would include physicians, it would include nursing homes, hospitals, any facility or program that serves Medicare recipients. So that automatic 2% across-the-board cut was put on the shelf for 2 months. All right, so we're good for that. On the physician payment side and the therapy side, as I mentioned before, we have kind of a 1-year reprieve in those areas. When it comes to the senior housing and aging programs, it kind of depends on who you talk to. We think we're good for at least a couple months, but as we'll talk about in a few minutes, the broader state of the federal budget is also in question, and so that will affect the ongoing funding levels of some of those other types of programs. On the tax side, for the most part, what was done on January 2nd was signed into law by the President on the 2nd, reinstituted the Bush level, or the Bush era tax cuts, if you will. So the income tax rates, the alternative minimum tax, the estate tax were largely returned back to the levels that they were at previously, because otherwise those rates would have all gone up. The one exception is for the quote-unquote, the high-income people, and there was a big debate in Washington about,
huge debate, right?
Should you tax those people more? If so, where do you draw the line in terms of income? And what they wound up settling on, and it was a compromise, was $400,000 for individuals and $450,000 for couples. So for individuals in those income categories, higher income tax rates and estate taxes are going to apply to them. So it's, for most, let's put it this way, for most of our constituents, the seniors, retirees, the disabled, tax increases really are not a concern.
Right.
So at least in the short term, that's a success.
Right. They were able to, stave those off and keep it at the higher levels. I guess it's 1 or 2% of the population that earn in excess of that, or are at that level. So, so again, for the majority of Americans, their taxes are not going to go up. Well, what is on the horizon for the federal budget? That's a loaded question, but hey,
Yeah, it's there's a lot of drama in Washington these days, and we kind of likened it to the having a bungee cord for the fiscal cliff, because we're going to be making another jump soon. Most people probably don't know it, but there hasn't actually been an enacted new federal budget in 4 years. We have not had a budget agreement in Washington in 4 years.
Yeah, I was hearing a discussion about that yesterday on
That's
one
right.
of the Sunday talk news programs, right? And,
That's right.
It surprised me. I didn't know that.
We've
But
had
it's been 4 years.
We've had these contingency resolutions that have kept the government running, for the better part of 4 years.
Right.
So, that complicates matters.
It's kind of where we get that expression, kicking the can down the road.
And
right?
we
Kick
have
the
been
can,
we have been
pass
kicking
a
the can.
resolution, we kick the can, and at some point we're going to be faced with having to make.
We will.
Yeah, and get a budget in place, but.
And there really are, there are a few different events that are converging here in the next few months that we're going to have to watch very carefully. And the first has to do with the federal debt ceiling, all right, which I understand the president spoke about today. At present, the federal debt limit is $16.4 trillion. Now, what does that represent? That is the congressionally set limit on how much public debt the U.S. government can incur. So why is that important? Well, I guess you can maybe think about it, and there's all these analogies about credit cards and, government being on, having a credit account. Well, that amount is the aggregate amount that the U.S. can be, in debt to anybody or obligated to anybody at this point in time. So that includes bondholders, it includes, anybody else who the government owes money to. And what's the practical significance of that? Well, the Treasury Department is saying that, with some things that they can do, that they can kind of extend the spending that we have obligated ourselves to as a government through probably mid-February to early March before we breach that $16.4 trillion debt limit. Because once we get to that level, the government is obligated for all these programs. It has to pay interest on its bonds. It has to pay Medicare providers. It has to issue, checks to a variety of different people, to state governments.
Yes.
And if that debt ceiling doesn't get raised, then there will be that point in February or March where the government is no longer able to pay its bills.
Right.
Then you could say the government is technically in default, which has never happened. We did come close, back in 2011 when this Budget Control Act was passed, and at the last minute, Congress and the President agreed on a plan to avert that from happening, but it didn't stop the rating agencies like Standard & Poor's from actually
from downgrading
the U.S. government. And so the concern here, once again, as we approach February and March, is whether or not folks can agree to raise the debt ceiling. And, it's the politics are already kind of lining up around that. There are, Republicans in the House and in the Senate that believe that what was passed in January, that staved off these cuts, that basically it was more dependent on revenues, i.e. more taxes, than it was on actually cutting program spending.
Right.
And there are some folks in Washington that would really like to see a much bigger number put on the table in terms of a long-term deficit reduction than what we've talked about. Now, that Budget Control Act in 2011 said we needed $1.2 trillion in cuts over 10 years. There are some folks in Washington that actually would like to see more like $4 trillion.
Yes.
So it's a much bigger number, and when you start talking about numbers of that magnitude, invariably, you have to start talking about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. They are very large parts of the federal budget, so it becomes a much bigger issue. So you have that debt ceiling thing going on. One of the other things that's happening, of course, is that we kick the can for 2 months on those automatic sequester cuts. And so March 1st, those cuts would be reinstituted.
Again, right?
March
1?
March 1, so Congress will have to do something about that. And thirdly, the continuing resolution that's funding the U.S. government, because again, we don't have a regular permanent adopted budget in place, that expires March 27th. So we now have 3 opportunities essentially for folks in Congress and the administration to be fighting over spending, and I think there's an interest on the part of many people for this to be a much broader, longer-term discussion, not just about the short-term need to raise our debt ceiling, but also to bring some more fiscal discipline to Washington and contain the overall spending, because the federal budget now, essentially, we're 2/3 of the spending is supported by all the taxes and revenues that the government's collecting. The other 1/3 is being borrowed.
Right. Right.
So some folks have said that it's really not a very sustainable situation.
Right.
And so
Right.
we expect that all those types of discussions are going to be entering entering the public domain in the next few months. So what's that going to mean for?
What's it going to mean for seniors?
What's it going to mean for
Could
seniors?
this all affect
Well,
senior services?
That's right.
I think I know the answer. Right? Go ahead.
And if people dig in and and don't want to do anything else on the revenue side, if they don't want to raise tax rates and that sort of thing, it's really going to put much of the focus then on the spending side, which is going to mean some of these ideas we've heard in the past, about reducing Medicare spending, reducing Social Security, cutting into Medicaid, which is also a very large program. That we could see many of those ideas resurface, and whether or not there'll be political support for them, I guess depends on how much brinksmanship is going to come into play around raising the debt ceiling.
Right, sure. Do I dare ask you this, Dan? What does your gut tell you? What do you think is going to happen? Do you think that we're finally going to see some bipartisanship in Washington and see the parties come together and reach a compromise that's going to be good for the American people? Or is there still going to be this constant infighting and kicking of the can? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, let's see. Put on my Karnak hat and try to answer that.
Yes.
Some of the political commentators have speculated that it is going to be a rocky few months, and that things are going to be very politically charged, and in that environment, it may be very difficult to get a longer-term agreement on deficit reduction. We have a president who's now been elected to his second term, so he is now, he's I don't want to say lame duck, but basically he's not running again. So, he's in a different spot, and of course, the election results, give him a bit more of a mandate than would have otherwise been the case. Yes. We have a new Congress sitting as well, and many members of Congress retired or didn't run again.
A lot of new ones, yes.
So there's a lot of new faces in Congress. You do still have the same leadership in Congress.
Yes.
So, and we still have, basically the Republicans are still running the House, and the U.S. Senate is being run by the Democrats. So that has not changed. So you can kind of see some of the political lines getting drawn, and I guess I would probably agree with some of the pundits that, if history is any guide, we'll come up with last-minute types of, interventions that'll stave off these crises. And perhaps once we get past these next few months, then, there can be a greater partisanship or lesser partisanship, more cooperation between the houses of Congress and the president in terms of a longer-range plan. And, again, what will that mean for seniors? I do think that, there will be some focus on the Medicare program, and the things that people have talked about there, include raising the eligibility age.
That's right. Yes,
like we did with Social Security several years ago. Sure. There's been people talking about raising it to 67 or some other, point in time. Again, Social Security, cost of living, that idea surfaced in the last couple months. That could, very well come back. There have been a whole variety of ideas on Medicaid side, but there you're also then involving the states who have their own financial problems, so it gets a lot more complicated.
It does.
So as an optimist, I would like to think that we will see a bipartisan agreement to reduce the deficit and to do it in a responsible way, but I think it's going to be a pretty rocky next few months.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be rocky. It's certainly going to be very interesting.
Right.
And we're going to be following it all along. And Dan, I can't thank you enough for coming down and joining me today and answering these questions. It's been very helpful. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope we can get you back. Will you come back?
I would love to come back.
We'd love to get you back here. So again, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our viewers as well. Have a good one.
Bye now.